Hello, everybody. My name is Bishop James Conley, Bishop of the Diocese of Lincoln, Nebraska, and I'm happy to be participating in this Be Formed course, experience that Father Burke Masters is leading you through, and I'm happy to participate with you at this class. I've been asked to take us through, I think, a very important. Of course, the whole catechism is important, but this particular section I think is extremely important because there are so many moral and social issues contained in this particular section. I mean, you open up the paper every day, if you still read the newspaper, or let's say you go online every day, and these issues are just in the news all the time. So this is an extremely timely and significant, consequential part of the catechism. We're in part 3, which is the life in Christ, kind of the section on morality. The first part of that section dealt with the understanding of the human dignity and sanctity of the person that were made in the image and likeness of God. And that's kind of the foundation principle. And then the second section, the Catechism takes us through the 10 Commandments one by one. And it's beautiful because the Decalogue, or the 10 Commandments, is the law given to us by Moses, from God to Moses, and revealed to the people of the Old Testament. And when Jesus was sent as the Son of God, took on flesh, the second person of the Trinity, in the New Testament, he tells us that I have come not to condemn the law, but to fulfill it. So Jesus is the completion, you might say, of the old law. He's the fulfillment of the old law. And as he said, the old law can be reduced down to 2 commandments: to love God and to love our neighbor. But how does that live out? And so these are where the commandments, there's a beautiful commentary on each one of the commandments. So we're in the second section there of part 3, and we're in Article 5, which is the 5th commandment. And the 5th commandment, of course, is "You shall not kill." And the quote there at the beginning of this section is from the St. Matthew's Gospel, the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus looks at the commandments, and he has this, what they call the antithesis. So he says, you have heard that it was said to the men of old, you shall not kill. And whoever kills shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be liable to judgment. So Jesus just lifts the bar now. I mean, not only, are the commandments, the commandments on their face value are wrong, but even he takes it to the heart. Even our intentions, our thoughts, our feelings can be sinful and can even break these commandments because, he's looking into the heart. And so as we go through this, the first part of this section has to do with respect for human life and the violation of this commandment, of the 5th commandment, and of course has a story of Cain and Abel, which is the first example of murder in the Scriptures, where that Cain murders his brother Abel, and that this is sort of the example of the first homicide in the Gospel, or in the Scriptures. And then it goes on and talks about the covenant and the love of neighbor and the love of God and innocence and righteousness, and then takes us all the way up to the Sermon on the Mount. But it's not such a simple thing to say that you shall not kill, because there are examples of killing which are not sinful. And this is where the Catechism talks about legitimate self-defense. That is, that we have an obligation and a duty to defend ourselves against an unjust aggressor, someone who's going to take our life. And that's valid. It's a long-standing tradition in the church, and it even has a scriptural basis. The Catechism 2265 says legitimate defense can be not only a right, but a grave duty for one who is responsible for the lives of others. The defense of the common good requires that an unjust aggressor be rendered unable to cause harm. For this reason, those who legitimately hold authority also have the right to use arms to repel aggressors against the civil community entrusted to their responsibility. So not only do we have a responsibility to defend ourselves if we're attacked, but also our immediate family. We have protecting those who are closest to us. And as you expand that out, communities, civil society, governments have an obligation to protect their citizens. And so and I'll talk about it later on when we talk about the doctrine of, and we'll go over that real quickly, the doctrine of just war. Even to the point that you can use lethal force against someone who is attacking you. Then the question of capital punishment comes up. And that's another issue that's very prevalent, right? The death penalty. And the church has a very clear and reasoned teaching on the death penalty. So 2267 says that assuming that the guilty party's identity and responsibility have been fully determined, and that's an important issue because oftentimes criminals are unjustly accused, and so you have to first of all make sure that someone is identified and their responsibility has been fully determined. The traditional teaching of the church does not exclude then the recourse to the death penalty if this is the only possible way of effectively defending human lives against the unjust aggressor. If, however, non-lethal means are sufficient to defend and protect, again, it's all about self-defense, defend and protect people's safety from the aggressor, authority will limit itself to such means as those are more in keeping with the concrete conditions of the common good and more in conformity with the dignity of the human person. In other words, the church says that there is a tradition in the church which allows for the death penalty, for capital punishment. But that's a last resort, only if it's the only way to protect the common good. And this was added to the Catechism after it was published by John Paul II at the end of this number 2267. Today, in fact, as a consequence of the possibilities which the state has for effectively preventing crime, in other words, the prison systems are so much better than they were in days when people were always, able to escape. By rendering one who has committed an offense incapable of doing harm, without definitively taking away from him the possibility of redeeming himself. So that's another reason for, let's say, a life sentence. A person has a whole lifetime to repent and to repent of their crimes. The cases in which the execution of the offender is an absolute necessity are very rare and practically non-existent. And this was John Paul II, and Pope Francis has added to that. I forget what the language is, but he said it's practically impossible to have a situation where you would say that the death penalty could be justified because of the threat of harm that this person might do. And so that's why more and more the justification for the death penalty is very, very becoming very. The argument is very weak, and I've kind of changed my ideas on this too. It seems to me that we have so much violence in the world today. This is just adding more violence. I mean, a society that takes care of its problems through violence, whether it be abortion in an unplanned pregnancy, putting someone to death in euthanasia if they become a burden on society and expensive, or putting a criminal to death, it's just adding more blood and more violence to the whole situation. And one of the things, this is kind of this is not theology, but I came across this saying: why do we kill people who kill people to show that killing is wrong? Why do we kill people who kill people to show that killing is wrong? And so the argument to justify the death penalty, although the church still says that that's legitimate, it's weaker and weaker these days, since we can protect the common good by incarceration. Moving on, intentional homicide, of course, has always been condemned. The direct and intentional killing is always gravely sinful. The murderer and those who cooperate voluntarily in murder commit a sin that cries out to heaven for vengeance. I mean, murder is one of the worst offenses against justice and charity. But we have cases of unintentional killing, vehicle homicide. There's all kinds of circumstances, and that's what the court systems are to determine what is the motive. Is this first-degree murder, or is this in cold blood, or are there circumstances which would mitigate the guilt? And so that would be an indirect violation of the fifth commandment, which would mitigate the guilt. Then moving on, and we've got to move quickly, I'm watching my clock here, to 2270, abortion. I mean, I always think of apparently the headlines in the New York Times the day after Roe versus Wade came down from the Supreme Court in 1973. Headlines read, Supreme Court puts an end to the abortion debate. That was in 1973. And here we are over 50 years later, well over 50 years later, and it's still in this election that just took place. Abortion was front and center. It's wrong. It's always wrong, and it'll always be wrong. What do we do about it? How do we address that? And that's where we're in the midst of it, right? It's been, the Dobbs case in June of 2022, June 24th, Feast of John the Baptist. Roe fell. Now it's up to the states, and the states. Thanks be to God, here in Nebraska, we just passed. We were one of the first states to successfully defeat an abortion initiative, which would have put a fundamental right to an abortion in the state constitution. There's no fundamental right to abortion. It's impossible. And so we were able to defeat that, thanks be to God. We have a 12-week ban, which is not the best, but at least protects moms and their kids after 12 weeks, after the first trimester. But still, what about from conception to 12 weeks? We still believe that a person is a person from the moment of conception. The church has always taught that. And it's always condemned abortion, going all the way back to the first century. The first century, just shortly after the death and resurrection of the Lord, the Didache, which is a catechetical book that's one of the oldest documents on the teachings of the church, says in its document, number 2.2, you shall not kill the embryo by abortion and shall not cause the newborn to perish. That was the first century. And ever since, the church has been consistent in condemning abortion. Life begins at conception and must be protected, especially in that most vulnerable state. And that's why we've always been against abortion. And it constitutes a grave offense. And even it's excommunication in canon law. Now, there are a lot of situations about culpability. I'm convinced that no woman really deep down inside wants to get an abortion. They talk about free choice. Well, it's not a choice. She's being coerced. Everybody she turns to is giving her bad advice. And so it's no wonder that women turn to this. But I think deep down inside, it's not natural that a mother would want to destroy her child in her womb. The child has an inalienable right, because we know from the very beginning everything is there in the human person, the genetic code, everything. All it needs is time to grow. And so that's why we're so strong on the pro-life issue. and even believe that for rape and incest, somebody as horrible as that is, that a child is no less a child if they were conceived by rape or incest than you or me or anyone else. I know maybe you were conceived by rape or incest. I don't know, but the point being is that they're no less a child because of that. It's a terrible tragedy. But then again, abortion is not going to undo the rape or the trauma of that event. It's only going to add another traumatic event. And I've done a lot of work in post-abortion counseling and reconciliation, and I've listened to women talk about this. And there is, I don't care what people say, abortion is a traumatic experience, and post-abortion trauma is a real thing, even though many people deny it. And women suffer from that, mentally, psychologically, but there's healing and hope. I mean, the church, the God forgives, and you can be healed from that. But to pretend like that it doesn't affect women, because not only is abortion abhorrent because it destroys a human life, but it also causes trauma and wounds women as well. That's why this Initiative 434 that we just passed was entitled Protect Women and Children. So not only do we protect the child in the womb, but we protect women from the trauma of abortion. And then it goes on, I better keep moving here, it goes on talking about the status of the embryo, because we believe that because everything is there, even in embryonic form, that's a human person. So, for example, frozen embryos, what do we do with all these children that are in liquid nitrogen? They're human beings, and so we're in a dilemma. It's interesting, in Europe, they stopped doing this, so they don't have the problem of all these thousands of children in liquid nitrogen. But it's a real dilemma, and we have to continue to think about that. It's immoral to produce human embryos intended for exploitation. For example, to produce embryos for experimentation, or even to solve diseases, or to experiment on embryos. The end doesn't justify the means. In other words, if you have a good end of wanting to solve a disease like cancer, you can't just do anything to get to that end. The embryo has a dignity, and that's why embryonic research is immoral, because we believe that this is a person. So that's a whole area. In vitro fertilization, that's very much in the news today, and the church has some beautiful teachings about that. But we can't go into them now. Then the next section is 2276 is euthanasia. Again, the end of life. I think it was Edmund Burke said, a society will ultimately be judged on how well it treated its most vulnerable people. The unborn, the elderly, the disabled. These are people that we need to protect because they're most vulnerable. And if we don't protect them, who will? And that's why the church's consistent ethic of life goes from conception to natural death and everything in between. So euthanasia, mercy killing, physician-assisted suicide, whatever you want to call it, end of life treatment, is taking someone's life in that sense is also a violation of the fifth commandment. So the church teaches, thus an act of omission, which of itself or by intention causes death in order to eliminate suffering, constitutes a murder gravely contrary to the dignity of the human person and to the respect due to the living God, his creator. The error of judgment into which one can fall in good faith does not change the nature of this murderous act, which must always be forbidden and excluded. That's 2277. So euthanasia, physician-assisted suicide, which you know is legal in many states now. State I used to live in, Colorado, it's legal there. And it's a violation of the fifth commandment, and we have to work to love those and to help those who are at the end of their life and are in pain or in terminal diseases. And that doesn't mean the church needs to keep someone alive indefinitely. The church has a beautiful distinction between ordinary means of sustaining life and extraordinary means, and we're never obligated morally to resort to extraordinary means to keep someone alive at all costs. God is calling people to himself. We can't get in the way, but we can't hasten it. We can't determine when that happens. We have to allow the person, but we don't have, if they're only staying alive because of extraordinary means, then we can discontinue that. Let's say if they're on a ventilator or something like that. But we can never hasten that death by injection, where we actually cause the death of another person. We have to allow them to die, allow them, God to take them. So this distinction, and also they deserve ordinary care. So we also have an obligation not to withdraw nutrition and hydration. Now, there comes a time at the end when you cannot assimilate nutrition and hydration, and it's not doing any good. Well, then a person doesn't have to continue to eat or have a feeding tube. But an IV, in other words, it's important that people have water. I mean, we're at 90-some% water as it is. And so you can't dehydrate to death. You have to continue to, even if it's just little bits of water in the mouth, that's giving, water to the thirsty and food to the hungry. It's the corporal work of mercy. But extraordinary means, we don't have an obligation to use those. Suicide. So suicide is the taking of one's life. And there's a whole thing we could talk about suicide, because as we come to know more and more about the psychological state of those who take their life through suicide, we see that most people are suffering from some sort of mental illness or stress. And because nobody naturally would want to take their life, they're under undue pressure and distress. So the guilt of that is mitigated tremendously. And, I've struggled with my own mental health issues, and I know that sometimes you're not in the state of mind. And that's where suicide, people, in a clear state of mind would never take their life. And so the guilt associated with that is highly mitigated. It's still against this commandment because it's the killing, but the guilt that one incurs is mitigated because of psychological circumstances. Then the second section has a section on scandal, which I'll skip through quickly. But scandal is any time that you weaken the faith of another person, and that's where people who are in authority can give grave scandal by positions they hold, like politicians or people who expect them to uphold integrity and they don't, can cause those who are weaker in faith to be scandalized. And so to avoid scandal at all time. Respect for health. We can't have a cult of the body. It's important. Health and wellness is really important. Diet, staying fit, exercising, that's all good. But it can also become a religion, right? It can become, you can worship health. And that's not good. That's imbalanced. Scientific research, the end doesn't justify the means. And this is where we get into a very, very interesting dilemma we have today, and that is organ transplants. The church has always condoned it and said it's okay, but as long as, the person is a dead person, or the organ that's being harvested doesn't cause the death. In other words, you can give a kidney, you can give an organ that's not a vital organ. So organ donation after death is a noble and meritorious act and is to be encouraged as an expression of genuine solidarity. It's not morally acceptable if the donor or his proxy has not given explicit consent. So you have to consent to it. You have to agree to it. Moreover, it's not morally admissible directly to bring about the disabling mutilation or death of a human being in order to delay the death of another person. This is where last fall, the fall of 2023, the American Academy for Neurology came out with a reinterpretation of the criteria for brain death. So the church has always taught that in order for someone to be declared dead, there has to be full cessation of the brain, even the brain stem. There has to be no brain function at all. Well, the American Academy of Neurology has sort of weakened that criteria. And, you can be almost dead is they're basically saying that. And that's problematic because oftentimes, with the great need for organs, a person might not be quite dead. And they'll go ahead and harvest the organs. And that's a big dilemma right now. In fact, there's a conference that the National Catholic Bioethics Center is putting on with Catholic University of America in February of 2025, bringing neurologists and palliative care people and ethicists together to kind of look at this and to see what is brain death, and can we use that criteria again. So that's, again, a very timely issue. A little section on kidnapping, hostage taking, respect for the dead. I'm going to skip through that. And finally, I'm going to conclude, I think, with this section on safeguarding peace. And in this section, it has this, again, it repeats this obligation to defend ourselves against unjust aggressors. But there's also, if someone wants to renounce violence and bloodshed in order to safeguard human rights, make use of those means of defense, and enable the weakest, and bear witness to evangelical charity, provided they do so without harming the rights and obligations of other men's societies, then they can take a passive stance. So the church doesn't, passivism is not part of the church's really tradition, but people can opt and not fight back and basically be martyred. So there is, but you do have an obligation to protect those around you and even protect your life in these circumstances. Again, avoiding war, especially if you're in a position of authority, is a duty, and not only a right, but also a duty. And it has the criteria for what is legitimate defense by military force. In other words, the just war theory. And these are the points on 24 or 2309, which are very important. And you can read through those. But these are the traditional elements enumerated in what is called the just war doctrine. And the church teaches that there is such a thing as a just war in defending the innocent. And you can read through those because we really don't have much time to go through them. But that's very important, I think, especially as a superpower. We have an obligation to defend the innocent. But it's not unlimited. For instance, non-combatants and innocent people must not be harmed in our efforts to defend against an unjust aggressor. For example, you can't use disproportionate means. That's why the question of the atomic bomb, which was the end of World War II, is kind of problematic because there were a lot of collateral damage and a lot of innocent people killed. Or carpet bombing, like let's say in Dresden, that was also problematic morally. So the defense has to be proportionate, and innocent bystanders and innocent civilians, there's going to be some collateral damage, but you have to it's got to be proportionate, is what the church teaches. The accumulation of arms in the arms race is also not a way to ensure peace. The arms race does not ensure peace. As well as the production and sale of arms. So the church always opts for negotiating peace. This is, when all else fails, only then resort to war. But Paul VI said, war no more. And so that's why it's important that we try to negotiate and to kind of work out an understanding before we take up arms. So anyway, I know it's gone a little time over, but I rushed through it. But this section's so important, and there's so much in this section, and so many issues that are very prevalent today that we need to be informed on. And like everything, it's like these glasses. I don't have very good eyesight. When I look out, everything's kind of blurry. But when I put these glasses on, I can see things clearly. That's our faith. We should never take the lenses of our faith off. We should see everything through the lens of our Catholic faith. So when we're making these decisions that affect, like going to the polls and voting, or the way we stand on abortion or capital punishment, or euthanasia, or in vitro fertilization, or the just war, or all these issues, we need to see all these issues through the lens of our faith. and we have to act on those. It's just not just private opinions, like I'm for the death penalty, I'm against the death penalty. What? Why? What's your reasoning? And we have to think those things out. And that's why I'm so happy that you're going through the catechism, because this is the way we formulate with the mind of the church. Sentiri cum ecclesia, Latin. Think always with the church. Think always with the church. The wisdom of revelation, of natural law, of the history, of the tradition of the church, of the catechism, all of this. This is such a great, great resource. Then we form our opinions, and then we form our understandings. But based upon the revelation of God and the sure and secure teaching of the Catholic Church. God bless you.